My DIL dumped my stuff on Senior Citizens Day, thank God, $15.00 M. The will she saw was just a draft. You're nothing but a wrinkled parasite, living off our pity. Vanessa's voice cut through the morning air like a blade. She didn't lower her tone, she wanted the neighbors to hear. She smirked, holding a chipped porcelain teacup from my mother's china set like it was a piece of trash. You smell like mothballs and regret, she added, tossing it carelessly into a cardboard box labeled $1.00 each. I stood at the edge of the driveway, my hands trembling, but my spine straight. Nolan was leaning against the garage door, arms folded, silent but smirking, as if this was all an amusing little show. Then Vanessa tilted her head toward the staircase, visible through the open front door. That bedroom? It's wasted on someone who's one fall away from the grave. We could turn it into something useful. At least then, it wouldn't just sit there collecting dust and whatever else you collect. I have lived in that 2-story house in California for 45 years. Robert and I built it ourselves, board by board, brick by brick, back when our hands were steady and our backs could carry beams without complaint. We paid it off decades ago, long before Nolan was even in high school. The deed has never left my name. Every wall had heard laughter and arguments. Every room held memories of Robert's voice, my son's footsteps, the smell of fresh-baked bread, and the sound of rain tapping against the kitchen window. When Robert passed, the house felt emptier, but it was still mine, my last fortress. Nolan and Vanessa moved in a year after Robert's funeral. They said they wanted to take care of me. At first I believed them. They brought groceries, helped with yard work, and sat with me in the evenings. But slowly the tone changed. The groceries became fewer, the yard work stopped. The evenings together turned into whispers between themselves and laughter that stopped when I entered the room. That morning was Senior Citizens Day, a day that always made me smile in small, quiet ways. Robert used to surprise me with breakfast in bed and a bouquet of yellow roses, saying, "You've earned more than one day, but I'll start with this one." This year, there were no roses, no breakfast, only Vanessa setting up folding tables in the front yard, arranging my life into price tags. She called it a fundraiser to fix the house, but I overheard her on the phone the night before telling a friend, "This is going to pay for our cruise. 2 weeks in the Caribbean, baby, out of this dusty old mausoleum for a change." I walked outside to see her lifting my wedding dress from a box, holding it up for the neighbors to see. The satin had yellowed with age, but I still remembered how it shone when Robert first saw me in it, his hands trembling as he reached for mine. Vanessa dangled it between 2 fingers like a rag. "Why do you even bother celebrating Senior Citizens Day? It's like throwing a party for a dying plant," she laughed, letting the skirt sweep against the dusty ground. The neighbors chuckled awkwardly, eyes darting between us. Some of them had known me for decades, but none stepped forward to stop her. I felt my throat tighten, but I didn't move. Vanessa's voice rose louder, sharp and cruel. "You're lucky we even let you live here rent-free. One call and I can have you moved into a nursing home by tomorrow." I caught Nolan's eye, silently asking him to intervene, but he looked away, tapping at his phone as if the sky had suddenly grown fascinating. My heart clenched, not at Vanessa's words, but at the quiet betrayal in my son's silence. I could have spoken up then. I could have told her that the deed to this house was still in my name, that she had no power to send me anywhere. I could have reminded her that I raised Nolan alone when Robert went overseas, working double shifts so he could go to college, but I didn't. My father used to say that a pot that boils too fast spills over, but a slow fire can melt even the hardest metal. I wasn't ready to spill yet. Instead, I let my mind drift to Robert's voice on the night before his last deployment. We were in the kitchen, the smell of coffee between us, and he reached for my hands with that calloused grip I knew so well. "If one day our son turns his back on you," he said, "don't beg, don't break. You've given him all of you. If the time comes, you'll need to keep what's left to save yourself." Standing there, in the driveway, with my life laid out on cheap folding tables and my dignity trampled under Vanessa's wedge heels, I felt the ember of that promise begin to glow. I said nothing. I simply nodded when a neighbor asked if the dress was really for sale, and watched as Vanessa named a price that wouldn't have bought me a sandwich. The humiliation was sharp, but it was also clarifying. This wasn't just cruelty. This was preparation. They were stripping away my things, my space, my presence in this home, so they could claim it fully for themselves. And I, the supposed wrinkled parasite, was about to become something they had never imagined. A patient, calculating woman with nothing left to lose. That morning, the breeze carried the sound of coins clinking in Vanessa's cash box, and the smell of my grandmother's cedar chest being hauled away by a stranger. I smiled to myself, just enough to keep it hidden. This was the day they thought they won, and it would be the day I began to make sure they lost everything. 10 years ago, when Nolan was 25, he got himself into trouble. It was a stupid, reckless mistake, shoplifting electronics with friends who thought they were too clever to get caught. They weren't. When I got the call from the county jail, my first thought wasn't anger, it was fear. I remembered the stories Robert told me about how quickly a man's spirit could break when he was locked away, how one bad night could change a life forever. I didn't have much in savings. The market had been unkind, and my pension wasn't what I'd hoped for. But I still had my wedding ring. White gold, small diamond, nothing extravagant, but precious, because Robert had saved for months to buy it back in 1975. Selling it felt like tearing out a piece of my own history, but I told myself it was temporary. I walked into a pawn shop, signed the papers, and handed over the ring. By that evening, Nolan was home, sitting at my kitchen table, promising it would never happen again. Vanessa wasn't around back then. She came into Nolan's life 2 years later, all sharp heels and sharper words. When she learned about the bail, she didn't thank me. Instead, she turned it into a story she could wield like a weapon. At family gatherings, she'd lean in close to a cousin or an aunt and say, "Alexa loves bringing up old mistakes. She acts like she saved us, but really she just likes making Nolan feel small." And just like that, a sacrifice I'd made quietly and out of love became ammunition for gossip. The worst part wasn't the lie. It was how easily people believed it. It spent decades being the dependable one, the woman who showed up, who worked overtime, who kept her promises. But all it took was Vanessa's smirk and a few words to turn me into the villain in their eyes. Years later, when I gave a small scholarship to the neighbor's daughter, a bright girl named Marissa who'd just been accepted to UCLA, Vanessa erupted. I'd known Marissa since she was a child, had watched her juggle school and part-time work to help her single mother pay the bills. I thought it was a kindness to help her cover her first semester's books. The day I told Marissa, she cried and hugged me so tightly I thought my ribs might crack. Vanessa found out 2 days later. She stormed into the kitchen, voice raised high enough for the neighbors to hear through the open window. "You help strangers but not your own family," she shouted, slamming her coffee mug down so hard a crack ran through the handle. "We've got bills piling up, Nolan's hours just got cut, and you're out here handing money to some random girl like your Mother Teresa." I could have told her that our bills were fine. Nolan's hours had been cut because he spent too many mornings sleeping off late nights, and my mortgage had been paid for decades. I could have reminded her that Robert and I had been alone in raising Nolan while he was overseas, that I'd worked 2 jobs just to keep food on the table. But I didn't. Instead, I watched her eyes as she ranted. There was no gratitude there, no recognition of the times I'd put myself last so they could have what they wanted, just resentment. Resentment that I wasn't bending my life to fit their needs. When Robert shipped out overseas in the early 70s, I was 24, barely more than a girl myself. Nolan was a toddler with a chest that rattled when he breathed, and every doctor's visit felt like a gamble we couldn't afford. I worked mornings at the diner, afternoons cleaning offices, and nights mending clothes for the women on our street. There were days I didn't sit down until midnight. I kept every letter Robert sent in a shoebox under my bed, reading them when the loneliness got too loud. Back then, Nolan would run to me when he scraped his knee, or hide behind my skirt when strangers came to the door. I was his safe place. But somewhere along the way, that bond had frayed, and in its place grew something brittle and cold. Vanessa's arrival didn't just widen the distance, it weaponized it. She had a way of making Nolan feel like every kindness I offered was an insult, every boundary I set was an attack. If I didn't agree to lend them money, she'd call me selfish. If I did, she'd remind me later how she never really wanted to ask, but I'd forced her into it by not offering sooner. Over time, The names they called me shifted from passive-aggressive to openly cruel: miser, hoarder, elderly squatter. Once, during an argument about me not co-signing on a loan for a new SUV, Vanessa hissed, "You're just an old woman clinging to things you can't take to the grave." Nolan didn't defend me. He just looked at the floor. It was then I realized they had rewritten the story of my life in their own minds. In their version, I wasn't the mother who had sold her wedding ring to keep her son out of jail. I wasn't the woman who had kept the lights on when Robert was halfway across the world. I was an obstacle, a gatekeeper, to a house and a life they thought they deserved more than I did. The more they repeated their version, the more it stuck. Friends I'd had for years stopped calling. Family visits grew shorter, more awkward. I could feel the isolation settling in like dust on unused furniture, and they liked it that way. Looking back now, I see it clearly. They were softening the ground, making sure that when they moved against me, no one would step in to help. If you strip someone of their allies, you make it easier to take what's theirs. And they were patient. They thought I'd grow weaker, more pliable with time. They thought wrong. When I came home from the grocery store that Tuesday afternoon, my arms aching from the weight of the bags, something felt wrong before I even reached the stairs. The hallway was too quiet, the air too still. I balanced the bags on my hip and reached for my bedroom door. The key wouldn't turn. I tried again, jiggling it the way I always did when the old lock stuck in cold weather. Still nothing. My stomach tightened. The brass around the keyhole was shiny and new. The groceries slid down my arm and thudded onto the carpet as I knocked. "Nolan? Vanessa? What's going on here?" Vanessa appeared at the end of the hallway, her phone in one hand, the other resting casually on her hip. She didn't even pretend to be apologetic. "Oh, that? Yeah, we changed the lock." My breath caught in my throat. "You? Changed the lock on my bedroom?" Her smile was small, sharp. "From now on, guests stay in the garage. And guests who don't pay rent leave." She didn't blink when she said it. She just stood there, looking at me like she was telling me what was for dinner. I felt heat rise in my cheeks, but before I could speak, Nolan stepped out of the living room holding a thick envelope. His face was flat, expressionless in that way he'd perfected over the years when he didn't want to admit he was ashamed. He handed it to me. I opened the envelope and pulled out a stack of papers, legal-looking, with a notary stamp and everything. The words at the top made my pulse jump. "Transfer of ownership agreement." "This is a joke," I said, flipping through the pages. "It's not," Nolan replied. His voice was low but steady. "Sign it, or you'll be in a nursing home next week." The words hung in the air, cold and final. My mind snapped instantly to the place I knew he meant, a low brick building on the edge of town with peeling paint on the shutters. I'd visited an old friend there once, a woman named Margaret I'd known since high school. She'd been left in a narrow room that smelled of bleach and neglect, her hair unwashed, her eyes glazed from whatever pills they were giving her. No visitors, no care. She'd gripped my hand and whispered, "Don't ever let them put you here, Alexa." I left that day with my heart in my throat, and now my own son was using that place as a threat. I set the papers down on the console table by the stairs. "This isn't legal," Vanessa laughed, a short, sharp bark that made my skin crawl. "Maybe not, but by the time you figure that out, your room will be emptied, your stuff will be gone, and you'll be too busy fighting for your spot in a care facility to do anything about it." I looked at Nolan, searching for even a flicker of doubt, some sign that he remembered the boy who used to run into my arms after school. There was nothing. He couldn't even meet my eyes. For a moment, the weight of it all pressed down so heavily I thought my knees might give out. My own son, my home, my life being dismantled piece by piece, not by strangers, but by the people I had loved most. I wanted to scream. I wanted to tell them both that they were making the biggest mistake of their lives, that this house was mine and always would be. But I remembered Robert's voice, steady, calm, telling me that when the time came, I would need every ounce of strength to save myself. That meant not wasting it on shouting matches with people who had already decided what I was worth. So I didn't sign. I didn't argue. I simply bent down, picked up my groceries, and carried them to the kitchen. Vanessa's eyes followed me, a smirk still on her face. Nolan stayed silent, leaning against the wall like he was already picturing the house without me in it. Inside, I set the bags on the counter and unpacked them one by one, my hands steady even though my heart was racing. Each can of soup, each loaf of bread, each piece of fruit went into its place like nothing had happened. Outwardly, I was the same Alexa they'd been pushing around for months, quiet, compliant, easy to underestimate. But inside, something shifted. This wasn't just about hurt feelings anymore. This was about survival. I thought of the shoebox in my closet, the one Robert had kept locked with his old army padlock. Inside were things he'd said might be useful someday. Documents, contacts, names I hadn't thought about in years. I thought of the dusty Rolodex in my desk drawer, filled with numbers I hadn't dialed since before Nolan was born. I thought of Frank, Robert's friend from the service, the one who'd sent a Christmas card every year without fail. I also thought about the recorder app on my phone, the one I'd never really used. By the time I'd finished putting the milk in the fridge, I knew exactly what I was going to do. I wouldn't fight them on their terms. I would wait. I would listen. I would gather everything I needed while they convinced themselves they'd already won. They thought they'd locked me out of my room. They had no idea they'd just opened a much bigger door. I waited until the house was quiet, Nolan in the garage pretending to fix something, Vanessa upstairs on a call that was half gossip, half venom. I pulled the old Rolodex from my desk drawer, its edges yellowed with age, and flipped through the cards until I found the name I'd been turning over in my mind since yesterday, Jack R. McAllister. Jack wasn't just a name from the past. He was a man Robert had carried out of a burning barracks in 1969. A man who'd sworn he owed my husband a debt he could never repay. After the war, Jack had become a reporter, the kind who still carried a notebook and asked questions that made people sweat. Over the years, he'd worked every beat from small-town politics to citywide scandals, and he'd earned a reputation for getting the truth, no matter how ugly it was. When he picked up the phone, his voice was older, raspier, but unmistakably his. "Alexa? Well, I'll be damned. Haven't heard your voice in 20 years. You remember Robert, don't you?" I said, my fingers tightening on the receiver. "He saved your life. Now I need you to save mine." There was a long pause on the other end. Then, where do I need to be? We met the next morning at the small cafe downtown, the one with the chipped mugs and the waitress who still called everyone Hon. Jack listened without interrupting as I told him about the lock on my door, the fake transfer papers, the threats. I didn't cry. I didn't need to. Every word I spoke was heavy enough without tears. When I finished, he leaned back, tapping his pen against the edge of his notebook. "They're not just pushing you out, Alexa. They're exploiting you. And if we can prove it, that's a felony in this state." That's when the plan began to take shape. We would catch them in the act, publicly, unmistakably, so there'd be no room for excuses later. Jack suggested the yard sale as the perfect setup. "If she's willing to sell your things in broad daylight," he said, "we'll make sure there's a camera rolling from every angle." I told him Vanessa had already been planning it, on Senior Citizens Day no less. That seemed to please him in a darkly poetic way. "Perfect," he said. "We'll make it a holiday to remember." But I wanted more than just footage. I wanted to draw them all the way out, make them so sure of themselves they wouldn't even try to hide their greed. That's when I decided to bring out the prop Robert and I had laughed about once, the mock will. It was something we drafted years ago as a joke, after watching a soap opera where a fortune split a family in two. The numbers were ridiculous, the clauses even more so. $15 million to a single heir, written in that stiff legal language that makes anything sound plausible. We'd tucked it into an old file cabinet, forgotten about it. I dug it out, smoothed the pages, and left it just barely sticking out of a drawer in the study, somewhere Vanessa would accidentally find it while she was snooping. 2 days later, I heard the soft thump of the drawer closing upstairs, followed by the unmistakable sound of Vanessa's voice on the phone. "Babe, you're not going to believe this. 15 million. It's basically ours. We just have to make sure she doesn't change her mind before, well, you know." Jack and I set the rest in motion quickly. On the morning of the yard sale, he would have 2 cameramen disguised as bargain hunters, microphones clipped to their jackets. A third camera would be parked in a van across the street, catching every word and gesture in the driveway. Meanwhile, I was already ensuring that when the dust settled, there'd be nothing for Vanessa and Nolan to claim. The real will, the one with the actual distribution of my assets, had been signed, notarized, and locked away months earlier. Not a dime was going to them. My house and savings would go to the Veterans Assistance Network and the California Senior Advocacy Foundation. Robert would have liked that, helping the men he'd served with and the people who'd walked this earth long enough to deserve dignity, not neglect. If Vanessa thought a fake piece of paper was her golden ticket, I was more than happy to let her believe it. The deeper she bit, the harder it would be when the trap finally snapped shut. By the time I left that cafe with Jack, the shape of the endgame was clear in my mind. They had started this war thinking I was too old, too tired, too fragile to fight back. They were about to learn that I wasn't just defending my house. I was defending my life, and I had no intention of losing. The morning of the yard sale dawned bright and warm, the kind of California day that draws people out of their homes and into the streets. From my bedroom window, I could see Vanessa in the driveway, wearing a new sundress with a floral print and wedge heels far too impractical for moving boxes. She had her hair piled high, gold hoops catching the sunlight, and she was already waving at passers-by like the queen of a parade. "Everything must go," she called, her voice carrying down the block. "Make room for the cruise of a lifetime." Tables lined the driveway and spilled onto the lawn, stacked with my things, Robert's service medals, my wedding china, the quilt my grandmother had sewn by hand before the Depression. Beside them, price tags fluttered in the breeze, insultingly low. A lifetime reduced to yard sale stickers. 25C/$1.00 best offer. I sat quietly on the porch swing, a book open in my lap. I wasn't reading, I was watching. Jack's team had arrived in staggered intervals, each one blending into the crowd. One man wore a faded baseball cap and carried a reusable shopping bag. Another had on a Hawaiian shirt and sunglasses, a camera lens hidden through a slit in the fabric. The third was a young woman with a stroller, the baby inside cooing at anyone who passed by. All of them had mics clipped discreetly, wires running into small recorders. Neighbors wandered in, drawn by the promise of cheap fines. I caught a few sideways glances, some confused, some pitying, as they recognized the items laid out on the folding tables. A couple of the older women from church looked like they wanted to say something, but Vanessa was quick to distract them with exaggerated stories about renovations and making space. One man picked up Robert's old leather jacket, turning it over in his hands. Vanessa leaned in, smiling sweetly. $5 and it's yours, she said. It's just been sitting in a closet collecting dust. Better someone actually wear it, right? It was all I could do not to clench my fists. Then she made her first real mistake. A woman admired my wedding dress, ivory silk, delicate beadwork, preserved carefully for decades. Vanessa held it up by the hanger, letting it dangle in the sunlight like a used towel. Senior Citizens Day, what a joke. It's basically a memorial service for old furniture, she laughed. The crowd chuckled awkwardly, unsure whether to agree or walk away. One of Jack's cameramen shifted closer, angling his lens just right. The sale went on for another hour, and I could see Vanessa growing bolder with each purchase. She downed a mimosa between transactions, her voice rising, her laugh sharper. Nolan joined her near the folding tables, holding a coffee cup but not lifting a finger to help. That's when the moment came. A young couple was buying my crystal vase, and as Vanessa wrapped it in newspaper, she leaned toward them, speaking low but loud enough for anyone within a few feet to hear. "Once she's gone, this house is ours, and I'll make sure she's gone soon." Nolan threw his head back and laughed. "Damn right," he said, tapping the side of his cup. "It's only a matter of time." The words hung in the air just long enough for Jack's team to get them from 3 different angles. I saw the faint nod from the man in the baseball cap, confirmation that they had it. By noon, most of the tables were picked clean. The medals were gone, the quilt, half of my china. Vanessa was counting cash behind one of the tables, a satisfied smirk on her face. I stood, stretching slowly, and went inside to make tea. My hands were steady as I poured the hot water over the leaves. Outside, I could still hear her laughter, sharp and careless, echoing across the yard. She thought today was her victory lap. She had no idea it was the beginning of the end. A week later, the segment aired. Jack had titled it, "Elder Abuse in Our Own Neighborhood," and it opened with a slow pan across my front yard the morning of the yard sale. The tables, the stickered heirlooms, Vanessa's bright sundress in the sun. Then her voice, sharp and unfiltered, rang out. "Once she's gone, this house is ours, and I'll make sure she's gone soon." Nolan's laugh followed, deep and careless. "Damn right, it's only a matter of time." The editing was brutal in its precision. Every cut was a punch. Vanessa holding up my wedding dress like it was trash, her mocking laugh. Nolan sipping coffee while strangers carted away my life for pocket change. There was no narration, no dramatic music, just their own words, looped over the images of what they'd done. The segment ended with my voice, quiet but steady, from an interview Jack had filmed in my kitchen. "They think age makes you powerless. It doesn't. It just teaches you patience." By the time the credits rolled, my phone was vibrating non-stop. Calls from neighbors, old friends, even people I hadn't heard from in years. Some were furious on my behalf, others offering help, but all of them had seen the truth for themselves. It wasn't just local gossip. Within 48 hours, the clip had been shared across social media, picked up by statewide news stations, and even mentioned on a national morning show. The phrase, "cruise of a lifetime," Vanessa's own words, had become a sarcastic meme. The police didn't take long. With the footage in hand and Jack's testimony, they coordinated with my attorney to file charges for elder abuse, unlawful conversion of property, and harassment. When the officers showed up at Vanessa and Nolan's rental, the neighbors gathered in the street, phones raised, capturing every moment. In court, the evidence played on a screen larger than life. Vanessa tried to claim the recording had been edited to make her look bad, but the multiple angles and clear audio left no room for doubt. Nolan avoided my eyes entirely, staring straight ahead as if willing the walls to swallow him. The judge's ruling was swift and uncompromising. They were ordered to repay the full appraised value of every item sold at the yard sale, plus a substantial civil penalty for emotional distress and exploitation. More importantly, a permanent restraining order barred them from coming within 500 feet of me or my property. When the judgment was read, Vanessa's face crumpled for the first time. Nolan muttered something under his breath, but his lawyer's hand on his arm kept him silent. The fallout was immediate. Word spread among landlords and property managers, and within days they found themselves effectively blacklisted from most rental properties in the county. Employers Googled their names and saw the headline, "Elder Abuse in Our Own Neighborhood," before they even finished reading their resumes. I didn't celebrate in public. That wasn't my style. But that evening, I brewed a fresh pot of tea, sat on my porch, and let the quiet settle around me. Somewhere out there, they were packing up what little they had left, wondering how it had all gone wrong so quickly. They still didn't realize it wasn't quick at all. It was years in the making. 45 years of building a home, of keeping my promises, of holding my ground. And now the ground was mine again, with the law to prove it. It was a gray afternoon in early spring, when the pounding started. Not a polite knock, not even an impatient one. This was the kind of pounding that made the front door shudder in its frame. I set down my teacup, took a slow breath, and walked to the entryway. Through the peephole, I saw them. Vanessa and Nolan. If the last time I'd seen them had been a portrait of arrogance, designer clothes, smug grins, this was the opposite. Their clothes were wrinkled and dirty, their faces hollow, eyes shadowed from sleepless nights. Vanessa's hair was unwashed and pulled back in a messy knot, and Nolan's jaw was covered in uneven stubble. I opened the door just enough to step into the threshold, keeping my hand on the frame. "Alexa, please," Vanessa's voice cracked on the word. We've been staying in Nolan's car for 3 nights. Nobody will rent to us, nobody will hire us. We just need a place to stay, just until we get back on our feet." I held my tongue. "We'll help out around the house," Nolan added, his tone halfway between begging and bargaining. "You won't even know we're here. Just let us in." "No," I said plainly. That single word seemed to strip away the last thread of humility Vanessa had been clinging to. Her expression hardened, and her voice dropped to a sharp, cold edge. "If you don't let us back in, you'll regret it." I met her gaze without flinching. "The only regret I have," I said, my voice steady, "is letting you in once before." Nolan's jaw tightened. "You think you're untouchable now. A piece of paper doesn't protect you forever." He stepped closer, and I could see the twitch in his temple, the coiled frustration just under his skin. But I'd already made the call the moment I looked through the peephole. My phone was in my sweater pocket, the line to the police open before I'd even turned the deadbolt. "Hello?" The dispatcher's voice came faintly through the speaker. "Ma'am, are they there now?" "Yes," I said calmly, not taking my eyes off them. "They're in violation of a court order." The sirens were audible within 3 minutes, the sound swelling from the distance until the flashing lights painted the street in red and blue. Vanessa's bravado faltered first. Her eyes darted toward the sound, her weight shifting back. Nolan didn't move until the cruiser pulled to the curb and 2 officers stepped out. "And Mrs. Whitaker," one officer said firmly, "you are under arrest for violating a restraining order." The click of the handcuffs was louder than the wind in the trees. Vanessa sputtered protests. "We just wanted to talk." "This is insane," while Nolan kept his mouth pressed in a tight line, his eyes locked on me with something between resentment and disbelief. "You did this to us," he muttered as they led him to the cruiser. "No," I said quietly, "you did this to yourselves." The doors shut, muffling whatever came next, and the officers drove them away. I stood there until the lights disappeared around the corner, the quiet settling in like a familiar friend. Then I closed the door, locked it, and went back to my tea. The settlement money came through faster than I'd expected. Between the court-ordered restitution for the yard sale items, the civil penalties, and the liquidation of what little Vanessa and Nolan still owned, the total was substantial. I knew exactly where it was going. Within weeks, I donated the entire court award directly to 2 places I trust with my whole heart: the California Veterans Assistance Program and the National Senior Advocacy Council in Robert's and my names. No endowment, no new foundation, just support where it's needed most. A month later, at a Veterans Appreciation Luncheon, I wore Robert's favorite navy-fueled dress and the simple gold brooch he'd given me on our 20th anniversary. The hall was full of veterans in uniform, some in wheelchairs, some walking with canes, all standing a little taller as the national anthem played. Jack was there, of course, with that same warm smile that had carried me through the worst months. When it was my turn to speak, I walked to the podium, the microphone humming softly as I adjusted it. "I was taught," I began, "that dignity isn't something you're given. It's something you hold on to, especially when people try to take it from you. This gift today is in honor of my husband Robert and every veteran and senior who has been told they don't matter anymore. You matter. You always will." When I stepped down, Jack took my hand in a firm shake. "Robert would be proud," he said, his voice low and certain. I believed him. A month later, I found myself sitting under bright studio lights for a talk show interview. The host leaned forward, smiling with that mix of curiosity and admiration that people seem to reserve for feel-good segments. "So, Alexa," he asked, "after everything you went through, what was the best part of all this?" I smiled, not rushing my answer. "They sold my things for pennies and lost their dignity for free, but in the end they still bought a home for veterans and seniors. Funny, isn't it?" The audience laughed, some clapping, and I could hear the quiet murmur of agreement ripple through the room. That night, when I returned home, the sun was just setting, painting the walls in shades of gold and rose. I paused in the hallway, my eyes settling on the framed photograph of Robert in his dress blues, his smile steady and proud. I stepped closer, resting my fingers lightly on the glass. "We won, Robert," I whispered. "We won." The house was quiet again, but it wasn't the lonely kind of quiet. It was the kind that comes when a battle is over and you've come out whole, when the walls you built together still stand and the people who tried to tear them down are nothing more than a memory fading into the dark. And that's my story. From the day they called me a wrinkled parasite to the day they were the ones locked out in the cold, I learned something I wish every senior could hear. Age is not weakness, it's leverage. If my story made you feel something, anger, satisfaction, or maybe just a little hope, then stay with me. I have more true stories, more quiet victories, more reminders that revenge has no expiration date. Subscribe.